Hello, welcome to another episode of Me&my Health Up. I'm your host, Anthony Harcher, a clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. This is an exciting episode as we are celebrating our first birthday of this podcast with our first guest on the podcast, Nina Kingsford-Smith. Intriguingly, this podcast was born when Sydney was first in COVID lockdown, and today's episode is being recorded in our second lockdown. The intent was to help others with expert health and wellness tips. And today, the purpose has not changed. We still inspire to enhance and enlighten the well-being of others. And today we'll be discussing self-love and good health with clinical nutritionist and disordered eating specialist, Nina Kingsford-Smith. So welcome, Nina. How are you coping with this second lockdown?
Thank you. First of all, happy birthday. That's very exciting to have the 1 year mark. Look, to be honest, I'm coping quite fine with it. I think sort of with nutrition consults, we can easily switch online, very luckily. And, you know, apart from work, I've just been spending more time with my little doggo, which has been nice, having some more time with him. So, yeah, I've been going quite well with it. Very grateful to say.
And I remember last time we chatted, we were talking about being present when you're doing dog walks.
Yeah.
Are you doing that?
Yeah, I have been. I've been enjoying walking with him and just sort of in general being more present with him. I find animals in general are a great way to be more present. So it's lovely.
They are, because they're so present themselves, and that just rubs off on us, doesn't it? They're so, just in the moment. And I find the same with kids too. Kids will bring you into the present moment because they always are living that present moment. So it's really nice. So just, for the listeners that may not have listened to our first recording, episode 1 on disordered eating, and then a follow-up episode, we actually did episode 23, which was on body image. Just please share some more about yourself and the great work you're doing around disordered eating.
Yeah, of course. So I'm a clinical nutritionist. I work one-on-one with clients in my private practice, and I practice from what's called a non-diet perspective. And so that's really about encouraging clients to shut out all of the external noise and confusion that there is about food and wellness and health, and to really tune into their internal cues and internal knowledge about what's best for them and what works for them as an individual when it comes to health or food or any of those sorts of markers. It's really about honouring you as the expert of your own body. And so I help guide them through that process of skill building and knowledge building about how to do that. And so very much what comes hand in hand with that is also working with, disordered eating disorders, body image concerns. That's really my area of specialty with what I do.
And you're so good at what you do. I've learned so much from the previous 2 episodes. You've really educated me, and secondly, it's inspired a new way of me working with clients. So I really like your approach around this non-diet approach and more based on intuitive eating and connection with food. And it's certainly had a real positive influence on me. So I really thank you.
That's really cool. That's fantastic. I'm so passionate about the education empowerment side of it, not only for our clients, but also for other healthcare practitioners as well, other nutritionists, naturopaths, dietitians, to help them practice from that sort of lens as well, because I think absolutely everybody out there would benefit from seeing food and health in that way. So that's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just thought, we'd touch on some previous episodes in terms of this disordered eating, just to, I guess, bring out the definition and when we're referring to it in this episode, so that, the listeners can really understand what we're talking about. So, if you could just share, the definition, or it doesn't have to be a textbook definition, but just a good brief summary of disordered
eating. So I think there's a lot of nuances between disordered eating and eating disorders. So an eating disorder is something that is a diagnosed according to a set of criteria, whereas an disordered eating, I sort of see it as what happens before an eating disorder occurs. So it's a lot of the similar behaviours, thoughts, beliefs around food, but it might be to a lesser extent or to not such an intense frequency. So, for example, if we're looking at things like compensatory behaviours around food, like that might be excessive exercise or something like that, or restrictive thoughts around food. So really, when it comes to disordered eating, how it actually manifests, it can be in so many different ways. It might be that restrictive piece, so that might be actually restricting food or having restrictive thoughts around food. So, for example, I shouldn't eat this, I shouldn't eat that, I should cut out gluten, I should cut out sugar, picking certain food groups or ingredients or that sort of thing to cut out. Repeated dieting is a really, really big one. So just constantly trying out all the latest diets, whether it's, again, sugar-free, vegan, keto, paleo, all those sorts of ones. So intermittent fasting is another really big one at the moment. There's all those sorts of things. It very often is tied into body image concerns, that sort of thing. But I mean, there are many more causes other than that. It can be like a control thing, it can be lots of different things. But essentially, it's a lot of fear and anxiety around food. It can be overeating as well. So pretty much whenever there's restriction, there's going to be overeating that at some stage follows. It's like very much a binge restrict cycle. So it can really encompass a lot of things, and it is a little bit hard to define as well, because a lot of those behaviours are actually really glorified in our society, I find. It's seen as a good thing to count calories, or it's a good thing to go on a diet and that sort of stuff, but really oftentimes it's very detrimental, those sorts of behaviours actually, and disordered, yeah.
What are the common trends you see in terms of what initiates this from the very beginning? Have you noticed that in your clinical practice, that you've seen some common trends amongst your clients, or, in terms of the research you've read?
A lot of it starts back in childhood. If you actually go back to childhood, and what I often do with clients is we'll do like a dieting timeline together, or a food timeline, or a body image timeline, and go back to their first memories of how they thought about food, how they related to food, and really sort of beliefs that were formed all the way back then really coming to play a really significant role in their lives now when it comes to how they relate to food. Other than that, it really is very varied amongst a lot of people. The types of clients I do see a lot of the social, cultural sorts of pressures when it comes down to things like, social media or media in general, and body image concerns. But I also think it's important to emphasize that disordered eating and eating disorders can exist completely separately from that, and they don't always relate to that. Trauma is a really big one. So having a history of trauma is, whether it's mental trauma, emotional trauma, sexual trauma, many different kinds, that can be a really, really, really big predisposing factor as well. And then, depending on the exact thing that's going on, like if it's a specific type of eating disorder, genetics can also play a role as well.
Yeah, so you've touched on a few really good points there. I'm thinking, like as you said, a lot of you see stemming from childhood, and I'm thinking, the way our parents behave in front of us growing up as kids, and kids aspiring to be like their parents because they love and adore them. I'm thinking, like, if there's language that the parents are using around the children, or if the children, see mum and dad, restricting their intake, or, saying particular thing, I can't have that will make me fat. And so I can imagine that has a lot to, it certainly plays an influencing factor on how the kid behaves later on in their life.
Yeah, massively so. Like you said, if you think of the example of, if there's a parent that is constantly on a diet, constantly trying to lose weight, saying, oh, I can't eat that, it'll make me fat, or, mummy can't eat that, or anything along those lines, unsurprisingly, it gives the child the message of, oh, okay, well, fat is bad. I shouldn't be that. I should control my eating to avoid becoming that as well. And it's those sorts of really sort of base, our brains like to simplify things in general, especially when you're a kid, and in those formative years when you really, really sort of cement in a lot of those beliefs. So it's really no surprise at all. But even like a really common one, and seems totally harmless when we're like as parents, and we all do it, but that concept of you have to finish everything on your plate. And so that really teaches a lot of us to totally disconnect with like hunger fullness cues and just to keep eating beyond the point of being full, because it's a really bad thing if you don't finish everything on your plate. So that's a really, really common one that I see pretty much in all clients as well.
And it's incredible how it's passed on from generation, because the Great Depression, resulted in that generation really valuing food because it was so scarce during the Great Depression, and they've shared that, saying, well, this is the food we have, you got to eat it all, because I don't know when the next. But then, as societies become more affluent, that trait of and as you said, genetics plays a bit to do with it, and you can imagine this being shaped into our genes, this way of bringing up children in terms of eat everything on your, because I certainly personally experienced that you must eat everything on your plate as yeah. And then, so the other ones you touched on were like the trauma and situations that have an influencing effect. So when I think of trauma, I'm thinking like, is food seen or restricting food as a way to deal with the trauma? Like if someone's experienced trauma, it's one way of coping could be going to food and eating it to make them feel better, because they're not coping with it. And there's that element with food that you can control what you put in your mouth, but in certain circumstances in life, things are out of our control. For example, COVID, is a situational thing that we're in at the moment where, the government says this is what you can and can't do, and hence takes things out of our control. And, then we think, well, what can I control? Well, I can control what I put in my mouth, and that makes me feel better. So is that, this ways to deal with stress, so to speak? Some people can resort to food.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the really key ways that it plays out in terms of dealing with trauma. And, when we're talking about trauma as well, I think we often think of it as like what's like big T trauma. So a big event that's happened, this one big traumatic event, but trauma can also be little T trauma as well. So lots of tiny little things that you might not even necessarily consciously realize has impacted you or been a traumatic experience for you, but it still has. So there's what's called ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, from, again, going back to childhood when we're growing up, and they're really correlated with eating disorders. So that could be something just like bullying, and even if that's sort of low-key bullying throughout all your childhood years, isolation, your parents separating when you're young, like emotional neglect, abuse, all sorts of things like that, moving to a new state if you're a kid and you don't know anybody for a while, that sort of thing, all sorts of things like that. And that is actually often really related to developing eating disorders when you're growing up. But again, for example, when you're an adult, COVID is a massive one. That's really actually, which we can talk about, but that has seen a really big spike in people seeking help for eating disorders. I think definitely the control piece is big. Like you said, so many things in our life feel like they're out of control, or they can feel like they're out of control. And food is one thing that you can control, whether that is eating more, or eating less, or eating a certain type of thing. It's something that we can attempt to control anyway. And then another really big factor is using food as an emotional coping mechanism. So whether that is to help distract us while we're eating so that we don't have to deal with our emotions, just to completely numb out. So sort of like a step further and just completely numbing out from anything. And this is where you might see, for example, somebody with binge eating disorder who reports that they just completely black out. Like they actually black out when they experience a binge eating episode. It can also be like a self-soothing thing. So sometimes food can provide a really lovely sense of comfort and nourishment and nurturing, like sort of a sweetness in your life, sort of metaphorically speaking. So it can really play a lot of different roles. And in that aspect, I think it's really important to note as well that using food as an emotional coping mechanism is not a bad thing. Like, emotional eating is not a bad thing. I so often see it really demonized and seeing it, it's really, really bad. You shouldn't do it at all. I am not a believer in that. It's not like you're going out and you're hurting anybody. You're not being violent. You're not taking illicit drugs or anything like that. You're eating. It's actually quite a safe thing to do. And it can be a very good coping mechanism. It's when I find that it can become tricky is when it's our only coping mechanism or our main coping mechanism, because then you think of all the other awesome things out there that could be supporting us that we're not giving space to, and we're not giving a chance for all of that to help out. And yes, while food, it can be great, it can only do so much. It can't address all those other things as well. So that's when I really encourage people to look beyond, yes, include food as a coping mechanism if you wish, but also look beyond that to all the other sorts of lovely self-care things that you can be doing as well, and consciously build up that sort of self-care toolkit that you've got.
And have you noticed anything around the lack of self-love, and whether that lack of self-love comes through what you said earlier around body imaging when you're growing up and thinking you're not a particular body shape, so therefore who's going to love you? You're not going to be wanted, and so that can result in that sort of disconnect essentially with your body and self-loathing about it in terms of something you can't control. I mean, our figures given to us, we have obviously, there's, I guess to a point our skeletal structures, really given to us. So have you noticed anything around that self-love that then, and then people start thinking, well, I'm not this sort of person, and no one's going to like me because I don't fit this sort of shape? Is there something you've noticed around that in terms of lack of self-love and eating disorders?
Yeah, massively so. I think that's a really good example where the eating disorders or disordered eating, body image, and your sense of self-worth or self-identity really all come together. And again, in many different ways, because we're all so different, right? We all have such different experiences. But for example, we might really not value ourselves for whatever reason that is, whatever past experiences we've had, whatever beliefs we hold. We might have a really low sense of self-worth. There might even be, that real self-hatred that we experience, and then almost using food as a form of punishment, whether that's in a really subconscious way, but sort of as a self-sabotage. So it might be, for example, binge eating and overeating constantly so that you, as a form of, punishing yourself because you don't feel like you're worthy of anything better, and you want to keep sort of keeping yourself in that pattern, that sort of unhelpful, negative pattern, that loop that keeps happening. The same thing with restricting food can be exactly the same thing. I don't deserve to eat. I'm not worthy of food. I'm not worthy of nourishment. I'm not worthy of this pleasure, because, food is such a pleasurable sensory experience, but some people might not believe that they're worthy of that either. And then definitely the way that we view our bodies very much plays into that, because, as we know, body image and self-worth in our society today pretty much we're taught that it should go hand in hand, sadly. So much of how we judge ourselves and other people, if you think of celebrities and all that stuff, the first thing that we do often is pretty much judge them on how they look before anything else, in Western society anyway. Yeah.
Very true. It's very sad in that sense. Yeah. Because, given that we've discussed of, things in your control and out of your control, then, certain body shapes are just hereditary. Some women have wider hips, some women have narrower hips, and there's nothing you can do about that. And I think it's sad that if you don't fit the media image or the model image, therefore you're out. So. Really keen to chat about COVID and the impact COVID's having, because in Sydney we're experiencing this second lockdown, and coping mechanisms for the lockdown can be excessive drinking or excessive eating. So please share this. And obviously this has been dragging on too. We first had our discussion, in the first lockdown when COVID first hit. And we're still talking about COVID today. So, what are you noticing in terms of your clients and disordered eating?
Yeah, amongst my clients, I've definitely noticed what I've personally seen amongst my clients is a lot of increased anxiety around COVID, and therefore using food in one way or another to be coping with that sense of anxiety and uncertainty as well. I know, so the Butterfly Foundation, which is one of the key organisations for eating disorders and eating disorder support in Australia, back in September last year, they'd reported a 57% increase in calls to their helpline over the course of the pandemic. So that's more than doubling. So more people are reaching out for help, whether that is more people developing an eating disorder when they hadn't had it before or they hadn't had issues before, or people relapsing, because that's often the case with an eating disorder. It's not like it just goes away and it's gone forever. People go through these cycles of relapsing or sort of transitioning from one eating disorder to another and back to the original one and that sort of thing. So that and a worsening of existing eating disorders. So you might still have an eating disorder and it's just been exacerbated. The symptoms have become a lot worse. So that has definitely been happening a lot throughout the course of the pandemic, and not just in Australia, but, everywhere. I know England, I'm pretty sure it was, has also reported an almost doubling in people seeking support for eating disorders. So I think it's related to a lot of different factors. It is, like we said, the uncertainty. So it's, I think, very hard for us as humans to have that uncertainty and that lack of control. Very, very tricky. The fear, the social isolation is a really, really big one. And, all of the impacts that's going to have on our mental health, increased anxiety and depression, all that sort of stuff. It's really, it's worsening our mental health. And eating disorders are a mental illness, right? Like that's what they're recognized as. And so that really makes sense there. I think two other really big key factors as well is the fact that our environments have changed. So for example, when we might have been going out to work, to an external workplace before, a lot of people are now locked at home a lot more. And whether that's home alone or home with the people that they live with, but you're suddenly in a different environment when it comes to food. And, for some people, they're now constantly surrounded by food. They're right near their kitchen. They can get food whenever they want. There's a lack of structure in their daily routine. There's not set meal, where you might have like your 12 o'clock lunch break at work or something. There's not that anymore. There's that lack of daily structure, and people feel less in control around food and around their eating habits. Then you pair that with the fear and anxiety and all that stuff going on and wanting to use food as a coping mechanism, and that leading to binges, and then you feel guilty around the binge. And so you say, I'm going to, eat healthier again. I'm going to diet. And then you restrict, and then you get sick of doing that. So then you binge it again. And it's just this whole cycle, right? So I think, that sort of that change in environment's a really big one. But then also one that really grinds my gears, and it happened especially during when all of it was sort of first happening, the first sort of lockdown, that I think it was a lot of rhetoric around the COVID-15 or the COVID-19 or something like that, but around gaining weight basically with COVID, and everybody saying, I'm putting on the COVID kilos, and all these, exercise plans coming out about how to shed COVID weight and all that kind of stuff. And that being incredibly, incredibly triggering for a lot of people. And triggering for people who already had already were predisposed to having issues around food and body image, but also created a lot of body image concerns for people who'd previously not had any issues to do with any of that, and now suddenly felt this really big pressure because a lot of people's bodies did change during COVID, right? Like a lot of people were eating differently, couldn't exercise as much. You might not be able to go to your usual exercise classes or sports games or gyms or whatever. And so naturally a lot of people's bodies were changing. And so there was a lot of added pressure in dealing with that as well. And even little things like, for example, being on Zoom calls more and seeing yourself more on Zoom calls, and people reported like really struggling a lot with that as well. So even lots of little things like that. I think there's so many things at play. But yeah, definitely a really big exacerbation in eating disorders and disordered eating around COVID. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, and very insightful in terms of everything you shared. In terms of how are you helping your clients with everything you've just shared around COVID, and what are the the tips that you share with your clients to help them through this time?
A big one which I like to do, and in general, I think it's a really helpful thing to do is, and we touched on it before, but really building up what I call your self-care toolkit. And so that's like this metaphorical toolkit that you've got. You can reach in there whenever you want and pull out whatever tool you need at that point in time to help you feel whatever it is you need to feel. So you might want to feel more calm. You might want to feel happy. You might want to feel nourished. You might need to release some anger. You might want some creativity. Any of those sorts of things. All your tools can go in there, and either you use the toolbox when you are feeling in need of it, or as sort of like a preventative thing as well. So it's like that whole analogy of keep your glass full. Don't wait till it's empty before you're like going to do something that's a self-care thing. Keep it full and topped up all the time. And so we create this self-care toolkit together. We'll sit down, we'll write out the list. And then I encourage them to physically either have it as a list on a piece of paper or on their phone, and keep it somewhere that they can refer to often. And I find that is really, really helpful, because if you've just stored it all up in your head, when you're actually in a situation when you're quite stressed, you're overwhelmed, whatever, it's very hard to access that part of your brain, right? It's not going to be like, oh, go do this. That's a good idea. But past you has written out this awesome list that all you need to do is pick it up, look at it and be like, yep, that looks good. That option looks good. I'm going to go and do that right now. And when we're talking the sorts of things you can put on that list, it doesn't have to be all the cliched sorts of stuff around self-care. It can be whatever works for you. So it might be like a foot bath or a bubble bath, or, if it permits, going to get a massage or something like that. But it can be random things, whatever makes you happy. Dancing about to the music you used to love when you were a teenager for that sense of nostalgia. Going to a park and playing on play equipment. I find a lot of things that reconnects you to like that inner child is really beautiful. Like playing board games. It might be doing something really creative, like we said, like knitting, drawing, sewing, and pottery class, something like that. Something that gets you to laugh. So watching comedy shows, watching random funny dog videos on Netflix, just calling up a friend and having a good laugh. It can be so many different things. I think letting out anger is another really important one. We sort of shun anger and the angry feeling. It's sort of not really accepted in our society, but it's really important to let out. So whether it's screaming into a pillow, dancing about to some angry music, like so many different things you can be doing and putting on your list. And like we said before, food can definitely be on there. And you can sometimes pair food with something else. So, for example, how this all plays out, you might have a really stressful day at work or, working from home, and you would usually mindlessly go to the cupboard as soon as you log off all your Zoom calls and just eat a whole bunch of food, feel really physically sick afterwards, feel a lot of guilt and anxiety and shame around it, and then the cycle repeats. Whereas the alternative might be you get off that Zoom call, you can acknowledge that you're feeling really stressed and overwhelmed, and you say, okay, I'm going to pick up my little self-care toolkit list. I'm going to have a look at it. Oh yeah, right now, just like having a cuddle with my dog sounds really good. I'm going to do that. I actually also still feel like that chocolate bar. I'm going to do both of them. And so you might sit down, have your dog on your lap, have a cuddle with him, and really mindfully eat the chocolate bar and actually enjoy the experience of it. Notice the flavor, notice how satisfying it is, notice the smoothness in your mouth, all that stuff, and actually gain what you're seeking from it. So whether it's like that comfort and that calmness, and you're gaining that from that experience. So I find that that is a really, really, really important and helpful tool. The other thing about that is also important is identifying the sorts of triggers, whether that's people or certain circumstances, times of day. For women, it might even be like time of the month in regards to your menstrual cycle. Could be so many different things, but things that might make you feel more of the negative emotions that make you want to reach for your self-care toolkit. And then you can just increase your level of self-awareness around it, right? So, for example, you might know that going to your mother-in-law's place makes you anxious and stressed, and it's not a nice experience. And when you come home from that, you'll often like binge eat on something, for example. So you might be able to identify that. And then so before you go over to your mother-in-law's house, you say, okay, I'm just going to do a few deep breaths. I'm going to take an extra 10 minutes just to calm myself before I go over, or to have a chat to my friend, or, something like that. And you can sort of preempt and build in these sort of self-care things around those sorts of situations, because we can't just, not all the time can we just avoid those situations completely. Sometimes we still need to do them. It's just part of life, doing stuff that's uncomfortable and unenjoyable sometimes. But we can build in this sort of self-care around that, so that we then don't resort to trying to control food either in a restrictive way or an overcompensatory way, or whatever it might be. And we've got that bigger level of sort of self-care around that. So I think that is one of the key ones that I'll always do.
Yeah, I love it in terms of, helping the client be more, self-aware of those triggers that, and you gave some great helpful strategies in terms of, prepare yourself, go prepared, so that, the trigger's less or, non-existent. So that was fantastic. And yeah, the self-care toolkit is awesome. I love the one about, doing things that you did when you were a kid, and you said, going to the park and playing on the swings. Yeah, like I love jumping on that swing and just swinging. It's just therapeutic, just being, going to and fro on and that good little feeling that you have when you, your tummy drops, that sort of, yeah. And then getting high on the swing and, feeling that you're on top of the world.
It's quite freeing, isn't it? Because
it
you're on a
is,
swing, you feel like you're flying, especially when you're little, and everything's so much
does.
higher off the ground and the world's a bigger place. Yeah. Yeah.
And I could, remember the thoughts I had when I was doing it as a kid was, I could fly to the moon, and, like it's just,
yeah, I love that. I love that so much.
So, really great tips. Thanks for sharing them. There's a question that came through from one of the listeners, and it was a great one around orthorexia. So, first of all, I'd love you to, define and please share what orthorexia is. And do you see it as potentially being a trigger for later on, disordered eating, or, are you noticing this, because this orthorexia trend is new, it's, and yeah, so please share some wisdom around orthorexia.
Yeah. So orthorexia basically refers to an obsession or a fixation on the quality of food. So whereas a lot of eating disorders, for example, anorexia, people will focus on the quantity of food, so they'll restrict how much they're eating. Orthorexia is more based on the quality of it. So this real obsession essentially with eating healthy or quote unquote clean foods. And it is not technically acknowledged as an eating disorder yet. So eating disorders, their diagnosis goes according to what's called DSM-5 criteria, which is like I think it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's what doctors and things use to diagnose mental illness. So orthorexia is not yet in that. There is proposed criteria for it to be included in there, and some clinicians recognize orthorexia as existing under the umbrella of one type of eating disorder called AFRID, which is avoidant feeding restrictive intake disorder. I think I've got that wrong. But some acknowledge it under that, and some acknowledge it under another umbrella of eating disorders, which is called OSFED, or otherwise specified feeding and eating disorders. So there's a lot of technicalities around, is it technically an eating disorder? Is it not? I think essentially we can get too caught up in the technicalities of it. Essentially, it is a very significant, I think definitely you could identify it as a form of disordered eating anyway, but it's really significant. It has a lot of real impacts and implications on people's lives. It can be incredibly limiting, incredibly overwhelming. I think it should definitely be acknowledged as a diagnosable eating disorder. What I think can also make it really, really tricky with orthorexia, and we sort of touched on this before, is a lot of the behaviours that you'll see in orthorexic people are glorified as healthy behaviours. So, cutting out food groups, eating only so-called clean ingredients, all that kind of stuff, it's seen as a healthy thing to do these days. But then when you've got, you can get to the stage where you're gluten-free, and that's not because you're celiac or anything like that. You've just decided gluten is bad and you shouldn't have it. Sugar-free, vegan, paleo, doing all these different things. People whittle themselves down to only being allowed to eat a few ingredients that they personally deem as, safe or healthy. There might be a massive amount of anxiety and fear around if they don't have control around their food choices. So, for example, going out for a meal with friends, going to a party, going to a function where they can't know exactly what they're going to eat and what exact ingredients are in that dish, they will either avoid it completely, or there will just be massive, massive anxiety and guilt and shame around it. So that can be a really big one as well. That leads to things like social isolation, all of that. And it is a really big predisposing factor as well for then going on to develop an actual diagnosable eating disorder, because it is so nuanced and it can occur in so many different ways, including being quite glorified in society. And because there's no official diagnostic criteria yet, the estimation of how many people are impacted by it in studies varies so much. It varies anywhere from like 6 to 90% of the population being impacted by orthorexia or orthorexic behaviours. And I think the key thing to take away is the numbers are definitely on the rise. It's just getting worse and worse. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that we need to pay more attention to in general, like the general public, to look out for in loved ones, and also definitely for any healthcare practitioners that are listening, for us prackies to keep an eye on it and to not actually be facilitating these sorts of behaviours and beliefs in our clients as well.
Yeah, it's shocking. Those statistics are so high, and I'm thinking, certainly the media, social media has got a lot to do with that, in terms of publishing headlines of, saying, coffee's bad or gluten's bad or, this is, yeah. And then I can imagine this person just thinking, oh, it's another thing I've got to eliminate. And then, as you said, they go out and they think, well, what can I eat? There's nothing there I can eat. And, they stress over it. And as you said, it can result in that social isolation and withdrawal, which has health implications in itself. So, it's and yeah, as you said, the societal sort of glorification of it is just reinforcing those behaviours, which is making it worse. Just on this restrictive eating, have you noticed any trends around food intolerances, food allergies, and later on developing disordered eating? Because certainly what I'm seeing, more and more kids are intolerant or have allergies these days, and I'm wondering if there's any trends of that then later on in life really affecting the way they view food and their connection or lack of connection with food, and potentially result. Yeah.
Really good question. In my clinical experience, I've definitely seen correlations. I think it's a complex one. I think essentially having food intolerances or food allergies, which often also means like gut issues, right? Usually all tied together. It contributes for sure to having a complex relationship with food, and therefore, increasing your risk of disordered eating or eating disorders. For example, it's understandable if we have gut issues, so food intolerances, food allergies, bloating, diarrhea, whatever sorts of symptoms we might be experiencing. it's very understandable that that can lead us to feeling anxious or disconnected from food. If we are telling ourselves this certain food I'm eating is going to impact me in a negative way, of course there's going to be that link between being fearful around what we're eating or being hyper aware of what we're eating and that sort of stuff. And then also as well, sort of, which we've talked about a little bit, often well-intentioned advice from healthcare practitioners can be very restrictive. Being told that certain foods are, good for you and bad for you, that they should be avoided, that you have to follow a certain diet, can lead to feeling more stressed or scared around food. And, it's walking a fine line, because sometimes there are definitely medical reasons that certain foods should be avoided for certain people, especially, of course, if we're looking at something like anaphylaxis and there's a food allergy there that can cause death, as well if there's something like celiac disease. And then the lines become a bit more blurred about intolerances, like how do you clearly diagnose an intolerance? It's not necessarily like a life or death situation like it might be with anaphylaxis, but it still might be having negative impacts on your health. And then so you're trying to make decisions around, for example, do I want to eat this, what's a common one, pizza that's got gluten and dairy, even though I've been told that I have gluten and dairy intolerance, and I notice that it might make me run to the bathroom, but it's at this big family dinner and I really want to be part of the celebrations. And what do I do? Because I either miss out socially, or if I do that, then I feel like I'm sacrificing my health, and it gets very confusing and overwhelming. So I think that definitely plays a part of it. And all of that can sort of surmount to there being a lot more rules that you impose on yourself around food. So a lot more restricted eating. A lot more can eat this, can't eat that kind of mentality. It can become we try and make it into a very black and white thing, where it's not. It's all those shades of grey, like I just said with that example with the pizza. That's like a really good example of that. And so I also will often see somebody who is, say, for example, with certain food intolerance, they're trying not to have that thing with that, and then they get into that really restrictive mentality, and then so they end up binging on that thing because they've told themselves they can't have it, they've avoided it for a certain amount of time, it's all they can think about, and then so they end up having a really, really large amount of it in one go, and that obviously is not beneficial at all, either mentally or for their health. I think, as well, it can contribute to orthorexia, like we were talking about before, that real fixation on what's good for me, what's not good for me sort of thing, quote unquote. I think there's definitely links. I think it's maybe around 25% of, it was a systematic review of people with gastrointestinal disorders also exhibited disordered eating behaviours and habits, and about 90% of people with anorexia or bulimia also have gut symptoms. And I mean, in that reverse, in terms of 90% of people with anorexia or bulimia having gut symptoms, that can be due to a whole host of other factors, nutritional deficiencies, lack of fibre impacting our migrating motor complex, all sorts of things like that. But there is definitely a correlation.
Yeah, I felt like it certainly opened up a whole new can of worms in a sense, in terms of, a lot of open-ended sort of, well, I can imagine from a parent's point of view, well, how do I now help prevent this, disordered eating? Because they certainly want to do the best by their kid, and saying, well, you need to restrict these foods because, they're going to result in tummy discomfort. However, I don't want to then my poor child later on in life then, experiencing further eating disorders. And is there any advice you have? I mean, I think obviously parents should come and see you, but it's a hard one to deal with, right? It's not.
Like we were saying, it's not black and white. There's lots of shades of grey. And when I say that, I mean, when it comes to like you, like whoever and their child, it's constantly checking in with how it's going. It's looking for all the little nuances, knowing that everybody, each child's experience is going to be completely different. I think one thing that's important to focus on is the education. So really helping people understand why these suggestions might be being made. Knowing that it is acknowledging that health is not just, for example, digestive health. It's not just our physical health. It's also that mental and emotional aspect as well. So at what point do you try and force these, for example, to what extent do you force these restrictions around food if you're trying to help their gut health, if it's at the expense of all these other aspects of their health as well? It's sort of, really weighing up all of that and seeing the bigger picture. Also really focusing on an abundance mentality rather than a scarcity mentality. And so when I say that, I mean, if you're a parent, it's not just saying to your kid, you can't eat this, you can't eat that. When you go to school, like if anybody offers you food, make sure you don't have anything with that in it. Or when you go to that birthday party, don't have that. That's focusing on that real scarcity mentality, right? It's focusing on all the things they can't do, all the things they can't eat. Instead, focus on abundance mentality. So what are the things they can be having that they do want to have? What are some really fun alternatives? So it might be a real encouragement of, let's have, what about this as a fun new option? Let's cook this recipe together. This sounds great. Getting them involved in the cooking process and the shopping process, and even growing, if you're growing like herbs or some fruits or veggies or something like that, get them really involved in the experience of food, of things that they can have and that they do enjoy as well. Not just what they can have, but things that they enjoy. Because there's always going to be something, and there's always a way to make the experience of food a positive experience in that sense as well. So I think that's a really, really key one.
Oh, beautiful tips. Thanks so much for sharing and closing that can of worms I opened. So just just wrapping up. I'm sure I'm sure there's still parts of the can that are still open. So how can listeners best contact you?
Yeah, so my best way to contact me would be probably my Instagram. I'm on that most often, and that's Healthy Happenings with Nina. And then from there, there's also, you can get the links to my website, which is ninakingsfordsmith.com.au, and my email address if you want to reach out to contact me. That's just contact@ninakingsfordsmith.com.au, but all the details are via my Instagram. And I've got on my website lots of blog posts. I've got a blog post on the Selfcare toolkit that we talked about before, one on like supporting body image, more information about the non-diet approach, all sorts of bits and pieces, and lots of recipes on there as well for people who enjoy cooking or want to get into some cooking more, maybe especially while we're going through the lockdown period. They might enjoy that. So
and I second those recipes. I've seen Nina post pictures of them, and I've actually seen her eat them, and I always get jealous. But I think I love some of that. So I thoroughly recommend you check out Nina's website. I'll incorporate all those links in the show notes so it's easier for you to access. And thanks again, Nina. I really appreciate the insights you've given us, all the great tips. And the third episode, actually, I haven't done 3 episodes with anyone, so it's always a first.
Thank you for having me back. It's always good chatting with you. I always really enjoy it. So
awesome. And it seems fitting. It's the first birthday, and we've covered another first today. So
exactly. It's perfect.
Yeah. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in for the first birthday episode and for being so supportive of Me and My Health Up throughout the year. We'll certainly continue to provide more insightful information around health and wellness in the years to come. So stay tuned for more insightful episodes of Me and My Health Up.